This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with life science experts and discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Bernard Hsu here with us as we talk about the importance of scientific communication in pharmaceuticals. So welcome, Bernard.
Thank you, Stacey.
Great to have you this week. And so for our listeners at home, and you obviously work in pharmaceutical and live this every day, Bernard, but pharmaceutical companies already have a huge task with drug discovery and development and meeting needs of patients and their providers in fighting disease and other ailments. And while this community of experts is practiced in creating pharmaceuticals, they are not always capable of relaying the information to those who need it. Providers and patients, et cetera. And the process of communicating scientific data, including the benefits, the risks, and outcomes of prescription drugs, is not only highly regulated like the rest of the industry, it can leave audiences confused and misinformed if it's not done thoroughly and with great care. So I'm really happy that you're here today to talk about this topic because it is a challenging one. So I'm hoping to kick us off here, Bernard. You can help us review the current regulatory guidances surrounding scientific communications, as those guidances really are varied and certainly depend on the specific audience you are targeting. So can you give us an overview, please?
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to the communications that come out of from a corporate organization, there's a lot of different audiences, like you had said. So what you see on TV as advertisement is the direct to consumer. So right. That has its own set of guidelines. And then companies also have to work with HCPs out in the field who might be investigators for company-sponsored trials, or sure. Those investigators may be getting industry sponsor through a concept that they've had. And so that has a different set of guidelines for how to communicate as well. And then you have commercial interactions. So you might hear about, salespeople interacting with HCPs. That has its own set of guidelines. And then also how the company wishes to conduct itself to the regulators is not necessarily regulated in itself, but the company has its own guidelines for how it wants to present itself.
And that makes sense, right? Absolutely. So there's there's a potential for a lot of different messages to be out there at any given time surrounding any product. So given these guidances and the regulatory folks that are involved, tailoring the message to the audience is not only very important, as you mentioned, in terms of promotion, but also compliance. So I imagine when regulators come in to the organization to do audits and reviews, this is one of the things they are looking at. What are the nuances in developing communications then to healthcare providers versus payers versus regulators versus patients? Because you mentioned all four buckets. So if you can just kind of explain how each is different from the other, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to dealing with HCPs out in the field, commercial has a very narrow width where they can speak to the product. It can only be on label. Anything that's off label must be unsolicited. So it must be the HCP asking about a different indication, or usually that ends up resulting in some kind of research concept. And so the FDA has actually issued some guidance for companies to have a mechanism where the commercial salespeople can go into the home office organization and say there was an unsolicited request for off-label information, and that department is authorized by the company to be able to send any data that they may have that they're willing to put out and give that information to the HCP. So there's one
So
way.
a salesperson can't just answer a question while they're on premise, then it sounds like, if it's not based on information that's already on the label.
Correct.
Do they need to then take that back and say, hey, I'll research that, or I'll have someone get back to you with this information?
Yeah, actually, they can't research it. The other person has to get back to them.
The team, yeah, okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so that guidance has been issued, and anything that has to do with research has its own dedicated field team. Usually you find it in medical affairs. And so that is dedicated strictly to research and dedicated strictly to data dissemination that that the companies may talk with the HCPs about.
Okay.
And so the thing is that sometimes you might have a disconnect in just that situation where you might have the sales or commercial person try to dictate the activity of the person in medical. And so because there might be some kind of question that may come up in the salesperson's conversation, they might want to say to the person, is medical science liaison is the official field designation for it. Right. They might say to the MSL, you need to contact this doctor because they had a question about so-and-so. And that is not allowed. That's prohibited as a regulation, because that would be commercial directing the actions of medical. And that could be seen as non-compliant per FDA regulation, because it could be looking...
conflict of interest, or?
It could look like, it could look like the salesperson is trying to butter up, so to say, the HCP by giving some kind of offer of potentially unsolicited off-label information, or through some kind of research that may not have been asked for in the first place.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah. And so that's one aspect of the communication. The second aspect would be what you would see in things like direct-to-consumer advertisements. And so when you see those ads, and you see them everywhere, like you're starting to see them now on Facebook and Twitter, those advertisements they're actually scrutinized really heavily. And the thing is they're not scrutinized until they're already created. So a lot of times when you see these advertisements on TV, they are almost mind-numbingly generic. And there's a reason for it. And that's just because they cannot guide the consumer in a way that might look like, after taking the medicine, everything is happy and everything's a field of flowers, even though that might be what imagery you might see. And so the challenge there is, how do you create an advertisement that would be passable, that you think would be passable, but then actually pass it through? Because if it gets rejected, then you might have to reshoot it, or you might have to reproduce it, and that might be several millions of dollars down the drain. So there's a risk that you have to take.
Right, and added time,
Yeah, sure. Exactly. And the medical information has to be exact. And so that's why when you hear that list of side effects, the side effects is actually a pretty simple clause in the FDA regulation that says it must be fair and balanced. And so even though you might say all the benefits of what it could do for the disease, right? Because if there wasn't a benefit, there would be no reason to use the medicine. Right. There are also side effects, right? And so you have to be balanced in that it's great for the disease, but it can also cause these. And so that's why you hear that long list sometimes. And some of these are things that might show up in less than 1% in the phase 3 trial. And
no, and I think it's interesting. And as when I was looking at the guidelines myself, it seemed that they're very specific in that you have to present the risks, but not only that, you have to present them, but you have to give them equal time and, equal, I guess, weight in terms of benefits versus risk. So it's not like these marketers can just say, oh yeah, and by the way, blah, 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 at the end. Like, you have to kind of balance it out, right? I mean, if you're talking about the benefits, you have to give equal time to the risks. Is that true?
Yep. Yeah. Well, in terms of the time, I'm not sure. You have to mention them though, just so that you can't it can't be one-sided to say only the benefits without any of the risk. Right.
Sure. So, okay, so that's that group, and that's challenging in itself, just because of the, as you mentioned, having to record, and then it goes to the review process afterwards. So I would think that, they have to be very careful in terms of their planning for the production of these types of advertisements.
Yeah. Yeah. Lots of time, and a lot of different groups touch upon what's in that advertisement. There's usually an ad promo group that sits within regulatory affairs. And then also the labeling group will have to get involved to make sure that everything is on label. And then you need to make sure that everything is scientifically accurate. So there's a lot of different hands that are touching upon all of those ads.
And what about advertisements for, like insurance companies? Are those similar to the ones that are going out to the healthcare providers? Or is that very different? Do you know?
So that's pretty different. There's actually separate groups that engage with payers.
Okay.
And so inside the company, there's scientific communications groups. And those scientific communications groups, they will they have a very lengthy approval process for what they call tools and slide decks that they can present to payers, and slide decks that they can present to HCPs on the MSL side and medical affairs. And so a lot of times the slides are generated by third parties. Sometimes they're not. It depends on the company. But then there's a very lengthy approval process that goes through medical directors and escalates pretty high up into the regional organizations.
Okay. So it sounds like they're very different groups of people handling each of these types of communications within the organization.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like one marketing group that's doing all pieces.
No. Yeah. Yeah. There's many hands touching upon everything. And a lot of times it does circle back to regulatory affairs to make sure everything's good. And then it goes through a legal department for another review, and then through IP. And there's a lot of different hands that touch upon everything that goes external to the company. I
think as just as consumers, we would never know that, right? You just think, oh, the ads just come out, they just magically appear. But wow, there's a lot of steps here. So with so many variations then on the messaging and so many different groups working on them, multiple audiences obviously are being addressed. And there's so many different channels out there, as you mentioned. There's TV, there's radio, there's print media, there's social media, and it seems to me like it would be really challenging to deliver a good message and not have mistakes happen occasionally. So I don't know if you've seen those kinds of things happen, but if a directed message reaches the wrong audience or is presented in a wrong way, I guess, what happens then?
What happens is you kind of see the climate that pharmaceutical industry is in right now. It's not particularly well liked, right? In terms of how its public image is right now, and there's many different reasons for that, and a lot of those issues stem from a long time ago, where the reason why we have a separation of commercial and medical and why commercial cannot direct the actions of medical, a lot of that came from things that were done wrong in the past, right? There was a couple incidences of some medicines in the early 90s where you had emails from the CEO come out in the court documents to say that they want everybody on this drug, and it made it look like there was no risk for all benefit, which we know is not true. And to push the medicine out to people, I mean, you're preying on people's fears that they might have some kind of illness when they might not actually have it, but then you're profiting off of it. And so that's where a lot of the issues come from. And unfortunately, a lot of that narrative has still stuck around, even though legislatively and in the regulatory sense, they've been somewhat fixed. Those things still come out. So one example I see really often right now is pharmaceutical advertising on social media. And they target it to, at the very minimum, they target it to HCPs who are now very active on social media. You have huge med Twitter, right? Group of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, they're all on these social medias. And you might see a tweet ad for a drug, and then you just see the comments, and those are not doctors commenting, right? Those are not medical professionals commenting. Those are, sometimes I wonder if they are actually people commenting because they might be bots. We have no idea. Right. But the things that they're saying in there go back to those days where, bad things did happen, right? And, there were abuses. And so it does kind of feed forward. So the advertising on social media, I would say, it's intended for HCPs many times, it doesn't reach HCPs. Or maybe it does and they don't say anything, but it reaches sometimes the general public who might not understand.
Right.
In some senses, it does reach patients, which is good, but the patients would probably already be on the medicine if they're getting the ad, I would think,
Sure.
if it's really targeted from the platform. And so what happens is you get this feed forward of the anti-pharmaceutical sentiment that we have right now. And I don't see it letting up, given all the misinformation that's out there right now, especially during pandemic.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And there's been, even when you have two professionals talking during this whole COVID outbreak, there seems to be conflicting information. So I feel like audiences are often left confused. They don't really know what to believe. And so they just have a distrust of the entire industry, which is unfortunate because, so many of us need medications that are coming from the pharmaceuticals. And, if you don't have that trust with the manufacturer and even your provider, how do you as a patient feel? Like that's just, that's a hard place to be in. And so the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry takes a hit, right?
Yeah.
So what kinds of resources and internal considerations need to be in place? We talked about how important it is that each department knows their audience, and obviously they do because they're very targeted in what they're doing. But in order for them to create error-free communications, what types of things need to be in place to make sure that they're not only compliant, but that they're putting good messaging out there that isn't confusing for the consumer or the healthcare provider? And are there formal strategic plans, I guess, and timelines that they're following?
Yeah, there are. And a lot of times they're centered around pivotal events like a launch, right? And so what happens is that companies, in anticipation for an FDA approval, there's usually a pretty lengthy process, can be up to 2 years or a year and a half, right? Where they're preparing for a launch of a drug. Right. And so they have multiple different groups that are centered around medical and commercial messaging and how they want to message, right? But the problem is that a lot of times they're preparing so early that the data hasn't read out from the confirmatory trial. And so they have to have different versions of the message to say, well, we're thinking we've moved forward on this phase 3 trial. It's been promising all the way up until now. While they're running the trial, they actually can't look at the results themselves. It has to be blinded to the investigator. And so they're not exactly sure what the numbers are going to be, but they have a general idea. And from there, they can start to craft a message. And there's a lot of what ifs at the early stages to say, well, if the data reads out this way, we could put it this way. If it reads out this way, we could also put it a different way. And so there are examples where something does clear the phase 3 and does give positive results, but they're not that good, right? And you might have a benefit in just, a couple surrogate endpoints, not even the primary endpoint, right? And let's just say it does end up getting approved by the FDA. How do you message that? Because if you get slapped with a warning to say you do have some big side effect, maybe even a black box warning, but you have a marginal benefit on a surrogate endpoint, like how do you message that, right? And so if you're a smaller company and that's the only thing that you have, and that's what you've been working on for many years,
yes,
right, you're going to have to work around that message. Now, bigger companies, they have dedicated groups for products,
right.
Or they can also separate by disease state. So they might have one drug that has multiple indications across several different disease states, and in that case, they'll divide the disease state and say, if you are one particular cancer versus another particular cancer, you're both working on the same drug, but you have to stay within your indication. So one type of cancer, say skin cancer, another type is lung cancer. You're both doing the same product, but we have to keep the messaging separate, even though it is the same drug. And so there's a lot of operating procedures that go into that, but there's also the element of the unknown when it comes to anything medicine.
this is like incredible to me, how time consuming and resource consuming it really is to create these messages. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that anything ever gets done. With all the regulations and the different moving parts, because when you are in clinical trials, like you mentioned, you kind of expect things to happen a certain way, but they may not. And so it's really challenging to be working on it, kind of putting the cart before the horse, if you will, in this. I know we talked about a little bit about social media, and you mentioned some of the posts that are going on there. And we've seen so many changes in the way that messaging is delivered, and the types of communications out there. Social media is one of them. Smartphones is another one. People have different ads popping up on their smartphones, whether they're text ads or push notifications, et cetera. And so I'm wondering where you think we are in terms of the quality of the communication that's going out through these different technologies, and how have you really seen messaging or communications change as these technologies became more prominent?
That's a good question. You're starting to see there's some trends that are happening, and like you can see, like some pharmaceutical companies are trying to use memes to advertise, which is passable. It depends on the regulatory environment, because even the ad that you see on Twitter still has to get vetted by the FDA, right?
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
so right now we're actually at a point where the FDA is pretty relaxed. It's a pretty sharp turn from about 8 years ago, where the FDA was requiring drug companies to do pediatric trials in drugs that were not meant for pediatrics, but they did that because they said there was a large off-label usage of some pediatric or some adult drugs for pediatric population. But a lot of that has been kind of swept under the rug. Okay. I expect to see that come back maybe in about another 10 years. So you'll see it swing back and forth. So right now we're at the pretty relaxed state. I guess you're starting to have people who are more of the millennial generation who grew up with internet, they call them rage comics and memes, and grew up on Instagram and Facebook, even MySpace if you go further back. So you're going to start to see that messaging start to take hold from those experiences of those people who grew up at that time. And so it's going to be less, generic video, so long as it's allowed, and more almost kind of, meme type of advertisement, which I think is interesting.
That seems like it would be really hard to manage from I guess the pharmaceutical standpoint. Yeah.
And I think the thing that's lost is that no matter like the medium of how they want to get the message out, the most important, I think, is the story, and it's the landscape of where we are in that current disease state. Like if you separate the product from the disease, right? Just don't think about the product. Right. Think about where we are in the treatment of that disease, what we know about it, and how we know about that. And there's actually always a face behind it. There's always a patient story behind how we know certain things are happening the way that they're happening. And people find that stuff really interesting. Right. Even though it is a little bit longer form, that interests people. It also gives them a sense of connection to the patient, because they might have a family member, or they might know somebody who's affected similarly, right? Or who's had some similar symptoms, right? And if you can make that connection, I think the messaging would be more valuable. The only downside is that usually has to be longer form content that would be harder to squeeze into a 30-second ad.
Right. I mean, because on social media, you have limited characters, limited amount of time. So to get a robust message out there would be a challenge, and still do it within the parameters that the FDA, or the guidelines that the FDA has set. And I'm just curious if you have any thought to, right now we are, in the midst of this pandemic, and the FDA has relaxed, as you mentioned, its guidance is on a lot of things to help get drugs and devices and stuff out into the public faster. Do you feel like that has, or will, impact the communication or the messaging for those particular products? I mean, we've got a series of vaccines that may be coming up in the next 12 months that are being worked on right now for the COVID-19 virus. Do you anticipate the communication or the FDA's guidances to be as stringent as they have always been, or do you feel like there's going to be some wiggle room in there?
I think given the situation, there's going to be some wiggle room. The FDA had been relaxing since before pandemic. So probably around 2016, 2017, you started to see a little bit of the shift.
Right.
And so I think that will be part of the story in 10 years when we start to see it being not so relaxed anymore, right? And so there's going to be a series of incidents that may happen. I'm not 100% sure if they will, but it may happen that will start to swing it over to a little bit tighter hold on how certain things are said. But we have to know that right now is such an urgent time. But at the same time, you're going to have that competing force of the distrust that's already been built. Right. And so I don't know exactly how you would combat that, because not necessarily are the people posting that people, right? They could be bots. Right. And also they might not actually be American. And so I don't know what's a good way to combat that distrust, but we know it's there and we know it's going to intensify.
Right. Okay. So one of the biggest challenges, it seems to me, in the communications is that you have, a group of experts, scientists, researchers, engineers who are trying to relay very technical information to non-expert people, a non-expert audience. Is it simply a matter of breaking down the material into manageable bites? Or, I know you've been successful, Bernard, in creating videos that deliver scientific concepts to average audiences, and they're done so well. I really commend you on that. But what were your strategies in doing this? And what's the whole take in the pharmaceutical industry, I guess, in terms of that, breaking that information down?
Yeah, definitely. So my personal approach to it in the videos is that I had to designate who my audience was. And for me, the audience was anybody who wanted to hear a story. Didn't matter if you were not interested in medicine or whatever. I'll let you know some of the medicine. You're not necessarily watching for the medicine, even though some people are under that impression because it dominates the second half. But it's really about the story and the patient. And so there's certain videos that are way more successful than others because I guess of how relatable they are, right? There's a case of a patient who ate 5-day-old pasta. He was a college student and he had liver failure overnight, right? And that's a very well-known case. It's taught in medical schools. It happened in Belgium. And then it happened again, I think, in Europe to younger kids who just had a picnic a couple days ago after they cooked pasta with their parents. And these kids were like 3 and 5 years old, right? And so the relatability, and to say like, hey, I do eat leftover food. Should I not? I'm not trying to scare people, even though people get that impression, but it's all about the story. And so a lot of times in the corporate setting, they're trying to think about what is the scientific narrative. And a lot of times there's a balance there because you have competing interests. You have the interest from the marketing group. You have the interest from the legal group who wants to make sure that everything is about as conservative as it can be. Then you have commercial people, and then you have medical people. And so it's how do you want to center the message? And a lot of times you see the difference in mindset. So the marketing group will focus more so on the product itself and how the product came to be. But the medical side wants to focus more on the disease state and how we know the research and how it developed to what it is at the current point in time and why that product was created as a need for that research or in a reaction to that research. And so when you have those differences, it is kind of hard to balance it. But if you center everything around a story, we can talk the story of the product. We can talk the story of the research. But we have to make sure that it's crafted in a way that's easy to understand, not just for the HCP, but if it could be easy to understand for the patient, you're going to need to center the message. It depends on the audience. But the story itself should be universal. And so to get rid of the competing interests would be the challenge inside the companies right now.
It sounds like that's a lot. I mean, you make it sound a lot easier than I would guess it actually is to do. You know what I mean?
It's pretty
really
hard. Yeah.
Have that balance and make it relatable to the audience, right? Do you think the industry needs to make any changes in their approach to information delivery? And how do you see the scientific communications evolving as we embrace even more technology and become, the industry as a whole, I feel like has become much more patient-centric than they were maybe 20 years ago. And so as we continue down that path, what are your thoughts in terms of maybe evolution of the communications to match?
Yeah, I think the communications, it's going to take some time because of the nature of pharmaceutical industry, it's usually lagging behind other industries in this particular space. But I think once you start to see a changing of the guard and, the people who were born in the middle 80s to the middle 90s, and, once they really start going into the workforce in large numbers, the experiences that they've had growing up in the early 2000s and, early 2010s, right? Those experiences are going to shape how that communication is going to be done. I don't necessarily think like computers are going to change very much. Smartphones are going to change very much. I think those are what they call mature markets.
Right.
And so, just give you an example, right? So YouTube is kind of the king of internet video, but then you have TikTok, right? And so YouTube is good for very long form content. TikTok's good for 30-second videos or less. And so even though they're both generalized to be video platforms, the way that they communicate to people are a little bit different. And if you as a company want to get a scientific message out, you can utilize both, right? There isn't a reason to use one over the other and only stick with that. You can, but the way that the landscape is right now is that, if you can make a longer form video, that would be great. Put it to the right platform. If you can make a shorter form video, put it to the right platform. And if you can tailor the message, that's always the best. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of innovations come out next to get attention of people. But really, like I said, it has to center around the story, and people want to know where we are at certain points in particular fields.
Right. No, and that makes perfect sense. And I was just thinking, I agree with you. The technologies, the computer, the smartphone, they're probably very mature, but we continuously see new channels, new ways of reaching the various audiences. And it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve and the different tactics that the industry then has to develop to reach them and to really tell that story, as you mentioned. I think that's very interesting. And so this has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you taking time today. So much good information that I think the average person, even who works in the industry in a non-communications manner, probably doesn't realize, how intense it is to create these messages and communicate with the various audiences. So I really appreciate you taking time with your expertise. Before we wrap today, I just want to see if you have any last thoughts or action items that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Well, I would say that world's changing pretty quick, and maybe in a year or two, we might have to update with some new information. But no matter the changes in technology, we know from thousands of years that the story is always paramount, right? And how the things have developed to be the way that they are is something that people need to know. That's why a lot of people are drawn to history. But also, if we go back to, the ancient Greek and Roman roots, right? We're drawn to those because of their stories. And so no matter the changes in technology or changes in industry or changes in politics, the story is always something that's going to draw people. And even, a long time far in the future, they're going to look back at us and they want to know our story. Right. And so that in the sense of communication, to me, that's always the most important.
Excellent. I appreciate it, Bernard. It was great to chat with you today. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Stacey.
I also want to give a big shout out to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and say thank you to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And as always, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and information about this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.